350 million years ago, Earth was the embodiment of a nightmare.
In the swampy thickets and dense, heavy air of prehistoric jungles, giant insects crawled on the ground and soared in the air, so enormous that their size dwarfed their modern counterparts many times over. So dangerous that they could have easily made you their prey. But one day, their reign was suddenly over. Some were forced to shrink, while others vanished from the face of the planet forever. Why did this happen? What, or even who, was responsible for their demise? For a long time, scientists around the world searched for the answer. Then, researchers from the University of California.
They analyzed more than 10,000 fossils, spanning hundreds of millions of years of evolution.
The results changed everything. It turned out that climate change wasn't the only reason for the disappearance of giant insects.
There was another cause. Something began hunting them.
Carboniferous period. Vast thickets of prehistoric jungle, swampy terrain, towering ferns, and giant horsetails.
Here, in this green wilderness, ancient insects were in charge.
They were so massive, they would hardly fit into the modern world. This was the Carboniferous period, an era when evolution gave insects a chance to take over the planet. But how? Imagine a world where trees didn't decay, but simply died and fell into the swamps, remaining there for millions of years. The ancient plants of the Carboniferous world actively absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen into the atmosphere, slowly altering the air's composition.
But when the life cycle of these plants ended, the process was very different from today.
There was no decomposition. Bacteria hadn't yet evolved the ability to break down wood. So dead trees didn't disappear. They sank into the wetlands, layer upon layer, accumulating as dense, undecomposed organic matter. It was from these deposits that coal eventually formed. And the carbon dioxide, once absorbed by plants, remained trapped underground. As a result of these processes, the oxygen level in the air reached a record 35%, compared to the 21% we breathe today.
A thunderstorm in that era could ignite wildfires on an unimaginable scale.
One lightning strike, and a forest saturated with oxygen would become a blazing inferno. Even damp wood could ignite from the smallest spark. At the same time, this oxygen overdose allowed insects to grow to unimaginable sizes. Picture this, you're driving your car. Suddenly, a sudden impact. Something hits the windshield. Just a dragonfly. Your wiper sweeps it away. But if it were a dragonfly from the Carboniferous period, the consequences would be far more dire. Dragonflies of that era were 10 times the size of their modern relatives. With wingspans of up to 2.3 feet, they were among the... But how were insects able to grow so large? It all comes down to their respiratory system. Instead of lungs, insects have a network of trachea, tiny tubes that deliver oxygen directly to the tissues. In today's atmosphere, this limits their size. The larger the insect, the harder it is to transport oxygen efficiently.
But in a high oxygen environment, breathing became more effective, removing the physiological barriers to growth.
And so, nature gave rise to the evolution of giants.
Today you might encounter a giant centipede, up to 12 inches long. Its appearance alone might make your skin crawl.
But in the Carboniferous, millipedes could inspire true horror.
The largest reached up to 8.5 feet and weighed around 110 pounds. And their diet included more than just plants. They were active predators, hunting anything in their path. If you'd found yourself in their world, you would have likely attracted their attention too. For an immense span of time, these giant insects ruled the planet, both in the skies and on the ground. But eventually, everything changed. These giants disappeared, leaving behind the tiny, harmless insects we know today. But why? What or who caused their extinction?
Drop in oxygen levels. 305 million years ago, the Carboniferous period was drawing to a close.
In the dense, steaming jungles of the ancient world, among giant horsetails and ferns, still crawls Arthropleura.
That very millipede, the length of a car.
Enormous dragonflies lazily fluttered above the treetops, but both they and their monstrous scorpion cousins
Soon, most of them would vanish.
Today, scientists state with confidence that the extinction of these giant creatures wasn't caused by a catastrophic event like the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs.
The truth was much simpler, and at the same time, more insidious. The insect world practically began to suffocate.
In the final few millions of years of the Carboniferous, the planet began to change rapidly.
Giant swamps dried up, and forests broke apart into isolated patches.
This process would later be named the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse.
It was during this time that invisible players entered the scene.
New types of bacteria that Earth had never seen before. Before their arrival, wood and dead plants remained untouched, accumulating in the soil. But these microbes learned how to break down lignin, a tough component of plant cell walls.
As decomposition began, carbon dioxide was released en masse into the atmosphere.
The oxygen levels that once fueled the growth of giant insects began to plummet.
The world was transforming. Forests fragmented, and oxygen became more and more scarce.
For giant millipedes and dragonflies, this new, thinner air became a deadly trap. By the middle of the Permian period, which began 299 million years ago and lasted for 50 million years, oxygen levels in the atmosphere dropped to 22%, almost the same as what we breathe today.
For giant insects, adapted to the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous, this was a serious challenge.
But the struggle for survival continued. Despite the disappearance of many giants, some species stubbornly held on. One of these surviving legends was Meganeura permiana, a true aerial predator of the Permian period. Even in the thinner atmosphere, this beauty could grow up to 17 inches in body length, with a wingspan of an impressive 28 inches. However, with each passing million years, things got worse. Oxygen levels continued to fall, the climate changed, ecosystems collapsed. More and more species vanished, and even the most resilient giants began to yield to the pressure of new environmental conditions. Among the last to fall were the Paleodictyoptera, an ancient order of flying insects that managed to survive until the end of the Permian period.
They could be considered the first gliders of the ancient world. These six-winged masters of flight reached wingspans of up to...
And surprisingly, they didn't meet their end because of predators or climate shifts, but from plants.
For millions of years,
Paleodictyoptera were perfectly adapted to their world. They had complex, piercing-sucking mouthparts and fed on juices, spores, and pollen. All products of ancient vegetation like ferns, club mosses, seed ferns, and early conifers. But by the end of the Permian period, around 260 to 252 million years ago, the world entered an era of sweeping change. Familiar plant life, including ancient conifers, seed-bearing ferns, and other prehistoric flora, began to rapidly decline or disappear. Scientists believe the same culprit was once again the high levels of carbon dioxide, which made plants less nutritious. As a result, these plants were replaced by new, more drought-resistant species that could no longer provide the same food source. Paleodictyoptera were too closely tied to the vanishing flora, and, unable to adapt, they disappeared along with it.
Predators are a new threat.
Although falling oxygen levels millions of years ago forced insects to shrink in size, scientists have long noticed a strange phenomenon.
Even when atmospheric oxygen levels rose again, giant forms did not return. But why?
This question became especially relevant while studying the beginning of the Cretaceous period, around 150 million years ago.
At that time, atmospheric oxygen levels began to rise, reaching about 20% compared to the 10 to 15% that had prevailed before. Yet insects remained relatively small. What stopped them from growing back to their former gigantic sizes?
The answer was sought by paleontologists Matthew Clapham and Jared Carr at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
They conducted a large-scale study, analyzing over 10,500 fossils of flying insects, spanning the past 320 million years.
The researchers divided this enormous data set into 10 million-year intervals. For each interval, they determined the maximum wingspan, a measure of how large insects could grow in each era.
They then compared this with the oxygen levels in the atmosphere.
Their goal was to understand when oxygen stopped being the main growth regulator for insects and what changed in Earth's ecosystems during that mysterious period. The results confirmed that for the first 170 million years of flying insect evolution, their size was directly linked to the oxygen concentration in the air. The more oxygen, the larger the insects, and vice versa. But between 150 and 130 million years ago, the rules of the game changed. The cause was the appearance of the first birds. It was during this time that Archaeopteryx emerged, the new, fearsome predators of the skies. They were small, feathered, crow-sized creatures, growing up to 20 inches in length and weighing just over 2 pounds. Although their flight was still far from perfected, they created a new evolutionary pressure for insects.
The larger an insect was, the harder it was to maneuver, and the easier it was to catch.
Soon, large gliding insects, relatives of today's dragonflies, disappeared. Their slow, gray birds tipped the balance for good. From now on, speed and agility mattered more than size. Over time, birds became increasingly nimble and skilled in flight. And between 90 and 60 million years ago, things got even worse for insects. A new predator entered the scene, the bat, specifically Onychonycterus, whose primary target was insects. The researchers' findings also revealed the broader picture.
Over the past 100 million years, atmospheric oxygen has remained relatively stable at around 21%.
Yet the largest modern insects only have wingspans of about 2.3 to 2.7 inches. Compare that to the late Triassic period, where oxygen levels were the same, but insects resembling modern grasshoppers had wingspans of 6 to 7 inches. This highlights a key point. Back then, there were no aerial predators, and insects could afford to remain large. Later, with the rise of bird species, predatory pressure began to limit insect size, even with the same oxygen levels. Today, scientists are certain that the extinction of giant insects was caused by a complex chain of events unfolding over millions of years. The first blow was the disappearance of tropical swamp forests. In their place came scattered, island-like growth. Then came bacteria, capable of breaking down wood and releasing CO2. Atmospheric oxygen declined, and it became harder to oxygenate tissues. Insects began to shrink, and many species died out. The final blow came with the arrival of the first birds, active predators that hunted insects and competed with them for food. As a result, the world of giant insects, which had thrived 350 million years ago, was gone 200 million.
But what continues to puzzle paleontologists around the world is this.
Even with today's oxygen levels, in the absence of predators, ancient insects could have been several times larger than their modern relatives. We've mentioned this before. Gigatitan vulgaris from the late Triassic period proves the point. An insect
This fact leads scientists to suspect that predatory pressure, rather than oxygen alone, is now the main limiting factor for insect growth.
Of course, the extreme sizes of the Carboniferous giants would be impossible without oxygen-rich air. But without natural enemies, modern insects could likely grow 2 to 3 times larger than they currently are.
At the same time, if those ancient giants were somehow transported into our world today, their fate would be grim.